The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sprawling prairie where the wind whispered secrets through the tall grass. Edward McAllister, an elderly rancher with a weathered face and a heart weighed down by memories, stood behind the creaking wooden fence of his homestead, watching in disbelief. The thud of boots on dry earth echoed, mixing with the cries of a girl barely more than a child, helpless and alone, at the mercy of men cloaked in the authority of soldiers. He squinted, fighting against the late evening light as his breath hitched in his throat. What did honor mean in a world where violence was the currency of power? He had fought his own battles long ago, against nature, against men, and mostly against himself. Each scar etched on his hands told a story of survival. Yet there he stood, paralyzed by an act of brutality unraveling before him. A girl of the earth, her dark hair tangled like the roots of the wild sage, was gripped by rough hands, her cries a haunting melody of despair that echoed across the vast emptiness of the landscape. He remembered tales passed down through firelight, stories of Viking warriors who, like these soldiers, had struck fear into the hearts of those who dared to oppose them. They wielded swords with a precision that could cleave a man in two. And here they were, wielding their authority against a girl whose only crime was her heritage. The juxtaposition of history and the present twisted his gut like a tightrope. How could men, who had once sworn to protect the innocent, become the very monsters they were trained to fight? Edward's heart raced, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The ranch had been his sanctuary, a place where he had buried his dreams and hopes, but now it felt like a prison. He could no longer ignore the pall of injustice that hung over the land like a dark cloud. As the soldiers laughed, the girl fell to her knees, dirt rising in small clouds around her. With each blow, Edward felt the weight of 1,000 suns pressing down on him, urging him to act. But what could he do against the organized might of the army? What could one old man do when the entire world seemed to turn a blind eye to suffering? Time slowed, and the prairie fell silent, the wind holding its breath, as if waiting for his decision. The sun dipped lower, and with it, the last remnants of courage flickered away. Would he remain a passive observer, forever haunted by the echoes of that moment? Or would he find the strength to stand against the tide? In that fleeting moment of choice, the balance shifted, and the landscape of his life seemed to change forever. Would he choose to step into the fray or let the winds of fate carry him away? The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows that crept across the dusty earth like the guilt settling into the old man's bones. He sat on a weathered wooden chair outside his modest home, hand-rolled cigarette dangling from his lips, a reminder that even the simplest pleasures had become tainted by torment. How could he have turned his back when the cries of that native girl echoed through the town like a ghostly lament, clawing at his conscience? He could still hear her voice, soft yet desperate, piercing the veil of dusk as the soldiers dragged her away. The acrid smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of sweat and fear that permeated the dirt street saloon. He had watched from the shadows, concealed behind the rotting timbers of the old barn, his heart thudding against his ribs like a war drum. In that moment, he was not a man of courage, but a hollow shell, paralyzed by the weight of his own cowardice. As the memory engulfed him, a sudden gust of wind rustled through the nearby sagebrush, its whispers an unsettling reminder that the land had witnessed countless acts of violence and despair. He thought of the Viking raiders, their boats cutting through the waves, leaving destruction in their wake. What drove a man to pillage, to murder, to stand idle when justice begged for action? Were they not all bound to the same earth, the same humanity, regardless of the skins they wore? He rose slowly, feeling the creak of his joints, the burden of unmade decisions aching in his soul. Each step toward the door was heavy, like the iron in a Viking sword before the bloodshed began. He glanced at the horizon, where the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, and for a fleeting moment, he envisioned the girl's face, eyes wide with terror, lips trembling as she whispered silent pleas. What would she think of him if she could see him now? Would she understand the fear that had rendered him immobile? The old man pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, wiping away the sweat that mingled with the dust of his shame. Shadows stretched longer, wrapping around him like the tendrils of a creeping vine. Each moment he lingered in regret felt like an eternity. Alone in the fading light, he pondered the weight of inaction. How many more cries would he ignore before the land itself demanded retribution? The weight of his conscience grew heavier, and as darkness fell, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer just a witness. He had become complicit in the heartache of a world that turned too easily from suffering. And in that stillness, beneath the weight of the stars, a question loomed like a grave marker. Was there still time to make things right? The sun broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the dusty plains that surrounded the old man's ranch. The ghostly silhouettes of barbed wire fence posts reached like skeletal fingers into the brightening sky. As the morning settled in, a figure appeared, framed against the sun's golden light, riding with an urgency that seemed to slice through the calm. It was the chief, adorned in a cloak made from the pelts of coyotes and eagles, symbols of strength and survival, the very essence of his people's spirit. His horse moved with purpose, hooves thudding on the hardened earth, rhythmically echoing the heavy heart that burdened him. Each beat resonated not just through the land, but within the old man's chest as he spotted the approaching figure. Could this be the reckoning he had unwittingly invited into his world? As the chief reached the ranch's weathered gate, the old man stood frozen, riveted by the sight before him. He had spent years with the land, learning its secrets and rhythms, yet the arrival of this formidable figure made the dust seem to swirl in unnatural patterns around him. The tension was palpable, an unspoken understanding passing between the two men, each representing vastly different worlds, yet tied together by the same dust and blood. "Why do you seek me?" the old man managed to ask, his voice cracking like the parched earth beneath his boots. He was met with silence, deep and heavy, as the chief dismounted, face stoically set like the granite cliffs beyond the horizon. The chief stepped closer, eyes fierce and unwavering, reflecting the turmoil that had gripped his people. "Justice is not easy to find when the world sees only skin," he replied, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, filled with a mixture of sorrow and righteous anger. "You witnessed the beating of one of my own. Where is your honor? Where is your mercy?" As the words hung in the air, the old man felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had known the codes of the frontier, but they had never demanded this kind of reckoning. His heart raced, his mind tangled in the memories of yesterday's violence, and something deep within him began to stir. The need for redemption, perhaps, or the dread of its costly price. Mercy can often be mistaken for weakness, he thought, gazing into the chief's unwavering eyes. Would he have the courage to confront the demons of his past? The chief stepped back, his presence still looming large as the old man wrestled with the implications of the chief's visit. In that moment, the old man knew the path forward was fraught with danger, not just for him, but for all who lived within the shadow of his decisions. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the vastness of the plain, a question lingered like a storm cloud ready to unleash its fury. Could he face the truth of his own complicity, or would he hide behind the ghost of silence? The wind howled through the cracks in the old man's cabin, a sound that seemed to echo the unrest brewing just outside its wooden walls. He sat hunched over the table, hands trembling slightly, a weathered map spread before him, lines of ink faded but familiar. He could almost hear the whispers of the land, murmuring tales of its ancient guardians. the native tribes who had roamed these territories long before the settlers arrived. This was their home, a sacred ground steeped in stories, much like his own faded memories of Viking raids that had carved up the old world. Had they too fought for their land with the ferocity of storms? In the quiet of his dwelling, the old man's heart raced at the thought of the chief's visit. Rumors of unrest among the tribes had reached his ears, each one more alarming than the last. The Comanche were restless, their warriors gathering like dark clouds on the horizon. The old man's mind drifted to a time when he had seen a band of warriors, fierce and proud, their faces painted like the dawn, riding with purpose. He had witnessed their strength and unity, and now it seemed they were preparing to stand against encroachment once more. As he fiddled with a small carving of a horse, a token from a time when peace felt tangible, the door creaked open, and a shadow crossed the threshold. The chief's son, tall and imposing, stepped into the light, his presence commanding the room. "The chief awaits your answer," he said, his voice deep, filled with the weight of expectation. "He means to speak of the future." "What future will that be?" The old man shot back, a tremor of defiance in his voice. His gut twisted as he sensed the gravity of the moment. Would it be one of bloodshed or a chance at understanding? The flickering candlelight cast shadows that danced like specters, leaving him with more questions than answers. Outside, the world was reminiscent of a time before settlers, before the land was marked and claimed. He could hear the distant thundering of hooves and the murmur of voices, a symphony of impending conflict. Where would this path lead? Would it be marked by honor and respect, or would it spiral down into chaos? As the old man looked into the eyes of the chief's son, he felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. Would they be able to bridge the chasm of misunderstanding, or were they doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? The air crackled with tension, the silence heavy with unresolved emotions, as a profound sense of foreboding settled over him. What was the cost of peace, and who would pay it? The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the old man's wooden porch, where he sat with Chief Tatum, his hands clasped around a steaming bowl of rabbit stew. The air carried the scent of rich herbs mingling with the earthy aroma of the damp soil beneath their feet. They shared the meal, a simple yet profound act that transcended the barriers that had divided their worlds for generations. As the chief lifted a piece of meat to his lips, he observed the old man's cautious yet curious gaze, a reflection of their mutual uncertainty. How did two men, so different in background, find themselves at this table? The old man thought of the stories he had heard as a boy of the fierce warriors who rode into battle, the fearsome Comanche who defended their land with fierce pride. Yet here was Tatum, a man who carried that same pride in his heart, but wore it with a gentler resolve. "Your people have a way with the earth," the old man remarked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "They say you know every tree, every stone, as if they were family." Tatum nodded, his deep-set eyes revealing a glimmer of warmth. "Each has a story just as you do. We live and die by them." His voice flowed like a soft river, as if the harshness of the world around them could dissolve in that moment of shared understanding. As they sat in quiet, savoring the stew, the old man felt a stirring within him. The tension from earlier, the weight of history pressing heavily on his shoulders, began to lift. He dared to ask, "What do you see when you look at this land?" The chief paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the dark outline of the mountains loomed. "I see home," he replied simply, the single word laced with layers of meaning. To Tatum, it was not just the land beneath his feet, but a tapestry woven from memories, losses, and the spirits of his ancestors. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue across the porch, they found their conversation turning to their children. The next generation caught in a world fraught with conflict. Will they learn to see each other as we do? The old man wondered aloud, the question hanging in the evening air like the last rays of sunlight. The chief's brow creased as he considered the weight of that future. "I hope," he replied at last, a flicker of doubt dancing in his eyes. As the shadows deepened, they both understood that despite their cultural differences, there was a fragile thread of common humanity binding them together. Yet the question remained, could this thread withstand the storm that was coming? The afternoon sun bled over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty expanse that stretched before the old man. He sat on the porch of his ramshackle cabin, worn boards creaking beneath him like the weight of his own memories. In this harsh land, where the wind whispered secrets and the earth bore the scars of countless struggles, silence had become his only companion. The same silence that had wrapped around him as tightly as the leather straps on his boots now seemed to weigh heavier than the rifle resting against the cabin wall, an iron reminder of the choices he had made and the voices he had silenced. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun soak into his weathered skin, the scent of sagebrush mingling with the faint trace of smoke from a distant campfire. The world he had carved out of this land was filled with echoes of laughter, of pain, and of sorrow. But those sounds had long since faded, leaving only the hollow resonance of his solitude. Each decision he'd made was like a stone thrown into a still pond. The ripples had spread and dissipated, but the stones remained, heavy and unyielding in their absence. What had brought him here, to this moment of reflection, where every unanswered question gnawed at the edges of his mind? He was a man shaped by the frontier, a survivor molded by droughts and dust storms. Yet the silence left him questioning if survival was enough. He thought back to the Viking longships he'd read about in tattered books, vessels that had braved the icy seas, driven by an insatiable thirst for discovery. What had he discovered on his own journey? Was he not just as lost as those ancient mariners, drifting on a sea of silence without a shore in sight? He opened his eyes and squinted into the golden light, swallowing hard as memories flooded back. The faces of neighbors who had drifted away, the laughter of children that had faded like the last notes of a forgotten hymn, and the girl he had failed to protect, whose screams had echoed long after the soldiers left. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, each one a brick added to the wall of silence that now enclosed his heart. The cabin creaked again, as if in sympathy with his thoughts. Time felt like a thief, robbing him of not just loved ones, but of the very fabric of connection he once shared with others, leaving him alone with a stifling quiet. Did he truly believe that silence could bring peace? Or had it only masked the tumult of his soul? As the sun dipped lower, the shadows deepened, and he realized that the silence might not be the refuge he sought, but rather a prison of his own making. Would he have the courage to break free? Only the fading light knew. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the old man's ranch, a sanctuary of dust and half-forgotten memories. He stood at the weathered gate, hands resting on the splintered wood, where rusted nails jutted out like the remnants of battles never fought. The air was thick with tension, a weight that pressed against his chest as he watched the chief approach. The chief's cloak billowed behind him, a dark silhouette against the orange sky, each step echoing an urgency the old man felt but could not articulate. "Why do you remain silent?" the chief called out, his voice carrying the strength of the mountains. "You have seen their cruelty. You have felt the sting of injustice. Will you let it continue?" The old man turned his gaze to the ground, tracing the lines in the dirt. Memories flooded back, the laughter of his children, the warmth of their hands in his. Hadn't he promised to protect them? A cold chill ran down his spine as he recalled the sight of the soldiers, their laughter mingling with the cries of the native girl, her spirit crushed under the weight of their boots. Every time he had turned away, hadn't it been a betrayal of something greater than himself? Will you let fear reign over honor? The chief pressed, stepping closer, his eyes fierce as embers. Your people need you. The land needs a voice. Without you, what hope remains? The old man swallowed hard, the bitter taste of hesitation lingering on his tongue. Images of the soldiers flashed through his mind, their rifles glinting ominously in the fading light. He could almost hear the click of the hammer, the finality of a gunshot. But then he thought of the chief, standing firm, unyielding in the face of adversity. Was there a warrior still dwelling within him, buried beneath layers of regret and fear? He glanced at the chief, whose presence filled the space with a palpable energy. What would you have me do? The question fell from his lips, a tentative whisper, yet it hung in the air like a challenge. Stand with us, the chief implored, his voice steady, the weight of generations behind him. Together we can face them. Together we can reclaim our honor. Are you ready to fight for those who cannot? The old man looked into the chief's eyes, searching for clarity amid the chaos swirling within him. He felt a flicker of courage, a long dormant fire igniting into a flame. But was courage enough to confront the soldiers? Would he be enough? Or would he fold under the pressure of fear once more? As the sun sank behind the horizon, casting the world into shadow, the old man stood at the crossroads of his fate, the weight of destiny heavy on his shoulders. A choice loomed before him, one that could change everything. Would he rise, or would he remain silent? The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty town of Elkhorn as the old man stepped out of the saloon, the scent of whiskey and regret still clinging to him. He adjusted his battered hat, the fabric worn thin from years of wear, and made his way toward the general store. The air was thick with tension, the whispers of townsfolk swirling like the dust caught in the evening breeze. Would they listen to him, or would they turn their backs once more? As he approached the store, he could see a group of ranchers gathered by the hitching post, their voices low but urgent. The old man could sense their unease, the way their hands fidgeted with reins and hats, like wolves circling their prey. What'll it take to get them to stand with us? He wondered as he approached, the familiar creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots echoing the weight of his purpose. Grayson! One of the men, a sturdy figure with sun-baked skin, called out to him. You here to talk about that chief and his girl? There was a mix of skepticism and curiosity in the man's voice, and the old man felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders like a boulder. He knew the tales of bloodshed and conflict, but he also understood the power of unity. Yes, was all he managed, his voice a gravelly whisper, rising above the hum of the evening. We must stand together, or we'll all be lost. The ranchers exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. The old man pressed on, recounting what he had witnessed. The soldiers and their brutality, the fear etched on the native girl's face. This isn't just about her, he insisted, voice gravelly yet steady. It's about our humanity. If we let them destroy her, what's to stop them from coming for us next? As he spoke, a chill fell over the group, the weight of his words sinking in. They had seen what happened when division took root. Families torn apart, neighbors turned to enemies. But could they really trust the chief and his people, whom they had been taught to fear? The old man could see their hesitation. It mirrored his own doubts, echoing the ancient Viking stories of loyalty and betrayal. But what if they banded together for a common cause, united against a threat that sought to divide them all? With every heartbeat, he felt a flicker of hope intermingling with the stark reality before him. In that moment, he realized that it was more than just justice at stake. It was a chance for redemption, for a new understanding born from the ashes of their past. As the ranchers began to murmur among themselves, weighing his words, the old man stood resolute, watching the horizon where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and crimson. Would they rise to the occasion, or would fear silence their hearts once more? The answer lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken promises and the threat of darkness yet to come. In the heart of the dusty town, the sun hung high, scorching the crooked roofs and the cracked earth beneath. A group of men gathered outside the general store, their voices rising like the midday heat, spreading tension through the air. They stood shoulder to shoulder, some with brows furrowed, others casting wary glances toward the horizon where rumors of soldiers and native unrest had begun to stir. The wind carried whispers of the previous night's brutality. How soldiers had laid hands on a native girl, the violence igniting both fear and anger among the settlers. "What if it happens again?" one man barked, his hand resting possessively on the handle of his revolver, the leather worn and cracked from years of use. The sun glinted off its barrel, a reminder that out here, trust was as scarce as water. Across the street, a woman peered through the tattered curtains of the saloon, her heart racing as she listened to the growing clamor. The townsfolk had always prided themselves on their unity, but now, the ground beneath them felt as unstable as the shifting sands of a Viking beach, where longships once sailed to battle with no clear skies in sight. The echo of history reverberated. Hadn't men once fought for honor and land, only to find themselves knee-deep in blood and betrayal? Are we to let them trample our way of life? Another voice called out, louder this time, igniting a fire of agreement among the crowd. The young men nodded eagerly, their eyes glistening with an unsettling mix of bravado and fear. Yet, behind the fervor, a fissure began to form. The old and the young, settlers and those wary of the native presence, began to split, the invisible line of loyalty drawn in the dirt. Old Joe stood back from the gathering, watching as neighbors turned against each other. He had lived long enough to see the faces of those who would protect or betray. But this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something worse than a simple quarrel. It was a storm brewing that would lay waste to all reason. What would happen when the guns finally spoke? Would blood bind them together, or would it tear them apart? As the sun began its slow descent, shadows stretched across the town, deepening the rift between brothers and fathers. The weight of history hung heavy in the air, a reminder that once loyalty was tested, the price could be too high for anyone to pay. What lay ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty, echoing the silent promise of a reckoning that would shatter the fragile peace. Would they choose to unify against a common threat? Or would they allow their fears to unravel the fabric of their community forever? The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dry earth as the old man and the chief sat on the weathered porch of the old man's cabin. The air was thick with tension, a sense of purpose crackling like the last embers of a dying fire. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he rolled a cigarette, his fingers stained with years of toil and worry. "What do we do with men who think they can take what doesn't belong to them?" he muttered, staring out across the barren landscape, where the distant mountains loomed like silent sentinels. The chief, adorned in a vest of soft leather, his hair tied back with strips of rawhide, leaned forward, his gaze steady and fierce. He had witnessed too much suffering in his time, witnessed too many injustices played out beneath the indifferent sun. "We confront them," he pronounced, his voice a low rumble, like thunder rolling across the plains. "Walk into their camp, demand justice. It's the only way to make them understand." The old man considered this, the weight of the chief's words settling heavily on his heart. "But they will have guns, a dozen men ready to fight. What chance do we stand against that?" The thought gnawed at him, the fear of loss creeping back like a cold wind through the cracks in his resolve. He had buried too many people already, too many lives lost to violence and indifference. Strength is not always in numbers. You know this. It is in the will to stand for what is right. The chief's voice pierced the old man's doubt, stirring a flicker of courage within. They could not allow the soldiers to think they could act without consequence. "We will gather others, friends, allies. They will come. They always do when there is a cause worth fighting for." As the two men plotted, the sun dipped lower, a blood-red orb sinking into the horizon, staining the sky with hues of desperation and hope. They spoke of gathering the weary souls of the town, those who had witnessed the injustice and felt the sting of loss. But will they come? The old man wondered aloud, feeling the weight of uncertainty in his chest. Or have they forgotten what it means to fight? The chief set his jaw, determination etched into the lines of his face. "Those who forget are the first to suffer, my friend. We will remind them." Together, they began to sketch a plan, their words punctuated by the crackling of the old wood beneath them. As they plotted the confrontation, the shadows deepened, hinting at the darkness that lay ahead. Would their courage be enough? Or would they too be swallowed by the silence that so often followed violence? The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dusty street of Elkhorn. A heavy silence enveloped the town, punctuated only by the distant thrum of cicadas. The old man, Henry Prescott, stood at the edge of the saloon, his weathered hands resting on the butt of his revolver, knuckles pale and white. Behind him, a ragtag group of townsfolk, some with rifles slung over their shoulders and others clutching pitchforks, shifted nervously, their eyes darting toward the troops that had made camp at the far end of the street. The soldiers, clad in dark blue uniforms that looked grim against the backdrop of the setting sun, lined up with steely determination. Henry's heart raced as he thought of the native girl he had witnessed being beaten by these very men just nights before. How had it come to this? Was this what they called justice? He could almost hear the whispers of his ancestors, men who had fought for survival and honor, resonating in his mind. The axe may be sharp, but words can sever bonds just the same. "Let her go." Henry's voice rang out, steady and resolute. The soldiers paused, surprise flickering across their faces. For a moment, the world held its breath, caught in a fragile balance between fury and restraint. "Your kind don't belong here," shouted a soldier, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can command us, old man?" Henry met his gaze, the weight of years and loss ensconced in his eyes. "I don't need to command you. I just need you to listen. We all bleed the same, don't we?" As the tension thickened, the air crackled with anticipation. In the distance, a hawk screeched, circling overhead as if waiting for the inevitable clash below. The townsfolk stood like a wall of resolve behind Henry, their breaths collectively held, uncertain of what would come next. Would the soldiers fire? Would Henry's words sway them? The ghost of a Viking past, a legacy of warriors who fought for their kin, echoed in Henry's heart. He had to protect those he loved, even if it meant standing against men dressed in uniforms. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring, and the question hung in the air. Who would draw first blood? Without a word, Henry stepped forward, the sun glinting off the barrel of his gun, his heart pounding in sync with the rhythmic mantra of his ancestors. He could feel the weight of the townsfolk's hope resting on his shoulders. But would this stand against the soldiers bring peace or spark a new war? In that charged silence, Henry felt the world teeter on the precipice of chaos, knowing that the next move could change everything. Would bravery lead them to victory, or would it unravel the fragile threads of their community forever? In the dim light of the moon, the dusty street lay still, as if the very earth held its breath. Shadows danced against the weathered wooden buildings, and a sense of dread hung heavy in the air. The old man, his heart pounding like the steady thrum of a war drum, stood at the edge of the town square. He could see the soldiers, those stubborn figures clad in blue, their faces illuminated by flickering lanterns, framing their hostility like a crude painting of intent. The native girl, with her defiant spirit unfurling like a banner caught in the wind, faced them with a courage that was almost palpable. How far would one go for love? The question twisted in the old man's mind as he contemplated the girl's position. She had been the light in his dark world, a spark ignited by her laughter, and now she stood between the soldiers and her people, refusing to back down. He felt a deep ache in his bones, a visceral reminder of the Viking raiders who once crossed icy seas, their axes raised in battle for honor and territory. The blood of ancestors coursed through him, urging him to act, to defend, to stand tall even if it meant facing the barrel of a rifle. The air crackled with tension as the soldiers advanced, their boots kicking up dust that hung in the air like smoke before a fire. The old man clenched his fists, feeling the weight of years of regret pressing down on his shoulders. He remembered stories of old, of warriors who sacrificed everything for their kin. Was this what it felt like? To stand on the precipice of bravery, knowing what was at stake? Every heartbeat resonated with a sense of inevitability, and he knew that courage, like a well-honed sword, demanded a price. The first shout erupted, a command wrapped in the sharpness of authority. The native girl's response was immediate, fierce, and unyielding, her voice a clarion call that echoed off the walls of the town. But just as the confrontation threatened to break like a storm, the old man took a step forward, heart racing with a decision he never thought he'd have to make. Would he risk everything for her? For their futures, intertwined in the tapestry of this untamed land? As the soldiers tightened their grip, preparing to strike, the old man raised a trembling hand, whispering a plea to the heavens above. Would his sacrifice be enough to stem the tide of violence? Or would it only lead to more bloodshed and despair? The truth loomed on the horizon, a storm threatening to swallow them all. And in that moment, he understood that courage wasn't just an act of valor. It was a haunting echo of choices made and lives forever changed. Amidst the palpable fear, a flicker of hope fought to survive. But would it be enough to light the path ahead? The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the scarred ground where the old man and the chief stood, both men marked by grief and loss. Dust still clung to the air like the memories of those they had lost, swirling in heavy clouds as they faced one another. The old man wore a weathered hat, its brim frayed from years of toil, while the chief, draped in a cloak of animal hide, held his head high, eyes piercing with a mixture of sorrow and determination. How many lives had been extinguished for the sake of land and honor? They had come to this desolate clearing, a space once vibrant with the sounds of life, now echoing only the rustle of wind through the withered grass. It was a place to speak, not with weapons, but with words. It was here the old man cleared his throat, the sound a raspy whisper against the stillness. We're both tired of fighting. The land isn't worth the blood that stains it. He shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking like old bones. He had seen many seasons, but the season of war had never left him unscathed. The chief nodded slowly, his expression a mask of stoicism. We have lost much, and this cycle of vengeance will only lead us to more graves. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of generations. Around them, the remnants of the battlefield lingered. Torn flags, the scent of gunpowder still mingling with the earth. How could they find peace when the land itself was so soaked in sorrow? A hawk circled above, its shadow gliding across their figures as if watching over the fragile truce forming below. The old man remembered a time when stories of valor echoed through the valleys. Tales that spoke of Viking warriors who had forged alliances despite bloodshed, finding strength in unity rather than division. Those were times when honor was valued above all. Let us agree to a temporary peace, the chief proposed, his demeanor unwavering. A chance to heal. We can share the land, but we must remain vigilant. The old man's heart heavy with doubt, he pondered whether such an agreement could ever hold. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of orange and violet, both men stretched out their hands, palms open, sealing the pact that would bind them, if only for a moment. How long could trust endure when both had seen too many betrayals? In that tenuous silence, the air felt thick with unspoken words, and beneath the surface, the scars of their pasts continued to bleed. Would this truce be enough to heal what had been broken, or would it merely pave the way for the next storm? The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the sprawling plains, the last vestiges of light flickering as if they were struggling to hold on in a world that seemed ever darker. The old man, his weathered hands resting on the rough-hewn rail of the porch, stared out at the empty dust trail that led to the town. He could recall a time when men spoke of honor with reverence, when it was not merely a word, but a way of life. A code that dictated actions and shaped destinies. But what did honor mean now? Was it defined by loyalty to a tribe, or by the blood spilled in its name? He glanced down at the ground, where a few scattered stones glinted like the iron of a Viking sword, remnants of battles fought long ago, battles that had shaped not just the land, but the very essence of those who walked it. The old man remembered the stories his grandfather told of warriors who earned their place in Valhalla, not by merely spilling blood, but by acts of bravery, mercy, and sacrifice. In those tales, the true measure of a man was not how many foes he felled, but how he treated those who could not fight back. In contrast, here on the frontier, men were quick to draw guns, quick to judge one another in a world that offered scant understanding. As the wind whispered through the tall grass, he pondered whether the concept of justice had also been lost to time. Was justice simply revenge served cold, or could it be something more profound? Could it arise from understanding and forgiveness, a fragile bridge across the chasm that divided settlers and native tribes alike? The violence that marred the landscape, was it the result of honor, or had it twisted the meaning of honor into something grotesque? He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, the dry air scraping against his throat. Memories flooded back. Faces of the people from both sides, those who had fought and those who had fallen. He thought of the young native girl he had witnessed being beaten, her dignity stripped away under the boots of soldiers. What honor was there to be found in that? He felt the weight of regret settle in his chest. Should he have stepped in? Should he have chosen a side? A crow cawed in the distance, breaking the silence as if to mock his indecision. The old man wondered, in this fractured world, was it still possible to stand for something greater than oneself? As twilight deepened, he remained on the porch, the echoes of the past swirling around him like dust in the evening light, leaving him with a question that hung heavy in the air. What legacy would he leave behind in this world of violence and division? Would it be one of honor lost, or could it become a call to reclaim it, however fragile that hope might be? The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in shades of burnt orange and deep indigo, casting long shadows over the dusty ground where the old man and the chief stood in silence. The air felt thick with unspoken words. Just moments before, they had stood on the precipice of conflict, the weight of history pushing against them like a storm. Now, as their eyes met, the animosity that had once defined their people seemed to dissipate like the fading light. "Have we not both lost so much?" the old man finally ventured, his voice shaky yet resolute. He wore a weathered hat, its brim casting a shadow over his lined face. A face etched not just by time, but by the burdens of countless decisions made in the name of survival. His hands, calloused and rough, grasped a small piece of wood, its surface smoothed by years of worry, a makeshift totem of his regrets. The chief looked down, his own hands resting lightly upon the hilt of a dagger. a family heirloom with intricate carvings that told stories of bravery and sacrifice. It glinted in the dying sunlight, a reminder of the struggles that had shaped his people. "You speak as if we are bound by shared losses," he replied, voice low and contemplative. "But can the past ever truly be washed away?" The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of generational wounds. As the shadows stretched, the old man took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. Perhaps it begins with understanding, with the courage to look beyond what we have lost and find what we can build together. The wind seemed to carry his words, swirling around them, mingling with the scent of cedar and the distant echo of laughter from a nearby village. The chief straightened, eyes narrowing as he considered this unfamiliar proposition. Could they forge a path where once there had only been conflict? "And if we fail?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we try again," the old man replied, a flicker of hope igniting within him. They stood there, two figures carved from the same land, yet shaped by different histories, both weary yet unyielding, their lives intertwined by fate's design. As twilight deepened, the two men shared a final nod, a silent agreement that transcended words. Each felt the weight of the moment, the promise of a fragile new beginning unfurling before them like the first light of dawn after a long, treacherous night. But as they turned to walk their separate paths, a lingering question haunted the air. Could the bridges they hoped to build withstand the storms of a shared past? The answer remained hidden in the rolling hills, waiting for the courage of man to unveil it.